Today, we become legends.
Hey, my name's Inter, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be reacting to Death of a Game Smite by Nerdslayer Studios. It's a video they released fairly recently. They've done one on Paladins as well. And I've watched maybe the first 5 to 10 minutes of this. I thought it was very interesting. A lot of people in my Twitch chat and YouTube comments and stuff have been kind of talking about this. It's had some buzz in the community. And so I just thought I would react to it, give my thoughts on it, provide some insight, all that kind of stuff. So let's just jump right in.
Featuring over 100 gods and deities from 12 plus different pantheons and being practically the only third-person MOBA, or the only one remaining, Smite, which launched back in 2014, was developed by beloved developer, hated executive suite, Hi-Rez. While
True.
Smite always existed, relatively speaking, in the shadow of the titans in its field, pun intended, the top-down MOBAs, if you will, League and Dota respectively, it technically has lasted longer than any other MOBA and arguably has had more success than the other ones too. That makes Smite one of the few non-big name MOBAs that found success, which makes it an interesting story. Well, on top of this being another Hi-Rez video, let's be honest, they are repeat offenders with Global Agenda, Rogue Company, Paladins just recently, and now Smite. And they are quite popular on the series for not the best reasons. Smite's success.
Yeah, both things that are true. Smite is the only MOBA that isn't League and Dota basically that survived any significant amount of time. There have been other ones that have been more popular even at times. There's been Paragon, there's been stuff like Battle Right, if you would even class that as a MOBA. Heroes of the Storm as well, but that's either shut down or on maintenance mode now, I believe. So yeah, in certain respects, you could argue that if you don't include Dota 1, Smite is the third most successful MOBA ever made. You can kind of make an argument for that, which is pretty interesting. And yeah, of course, the point about Hi-Rez, great developers, terrible management is basically the synopsis of Hi-Rez Studios as a company, pretty much.
Success, though, was obtained against the odds and in spite of so many of the things working against the game and, well, company. But sadly, because Smite is being talked about in the series for this episode, it's been either moved to maintenance mode or is soon to be facing the chopping block, which the former just recently happened as of a month ago of the video launch in 2025. Worse, for Smite 1 at least, a sequel was released, which effectively means that the development team has fully moved on. But this is the Death of a Game series, detectives, and most of you know that, but let me cook.
Yes, chef? Say it back!
It's a series where you choose a dead or dying gamer company and try to find the largest contributing factors to its death, failure, or shifting to the bench by utilizing a timeline of events where we pick up various clues along the way, all culminating in a final deduction. Every detective's favorite moment, where we crack the case. The story begins, well, ironically, the story begins pretty much the same as the Paladin story does, but we won't spend too much time talking about that or Overwatch. The other episode did a lot of that, don't worry. But Hi-Rez, a company located in Georgia and holding a strong 2.2 company rating on Google, despite their negative reputation, at one point had a more positive reputation of being known as being a developer who could make fun games, just not being able to manage them very well. Following the mishandling.
Yep, that is exactly it, dude. That is exactly it. That's every single Hi-Rez game in existence. They know how to make a baseline fun game. Paladins, Realm Royale, Smite, Global Agenda, I've heard was a lot of fun, though I never played it. But then they just mismanaged them to hell. Realm Royale is the biggest offender of this, to be honest. That game, it peaked at almost 200,000 players on Steam or something like that. It was arguably their most successful game ever, and then they completely fumbled the back with that one.
Slowing down of their hit Global Agenda, a sci-fi MMORPG FPS, Hi-Rez would go back to the drawing board and begin working on a project that would go by the name of Aurum. What would start as a sci-fi project to pay homage to Global Agenda, which is one of my favorite games I might add, would eventually become fantasy. And during this time, Project Aurum would eventually fork off into two different projects, following different trends of the time. And yes, that's also true about Paladins, because Team Fortress 2 came way before Overwatch or Paladins. I mean, come on guys. The second project fork was none other than the subject of this video, Smite, featuring gods and deities from multiple different pantheons such as the Arthurian legends, Babylonian, Celtic, and more. Smite would mimic the classic MOBA gameplay style with its main mode, Conquest, with 3 lanes and their pushing creeps, 5 versus 5, a jungle with various buff-holding creeps, and of course towers and a titan that must be defeated to win. The main differences with Smite being, of course, the third-person camera and gameplay, and the fact that it utilized well-known characters of history and legend. The third-person gameplay would allow for near shooter-like combat for certain characters and fast-paced action combat for just about everybody else. This introduced a whole new potential audience who was more familiar with this type of combat and approach. Something I need to acknowledge, and this is where I will admit a L from a previous video, in fact just the recent Paladins one. After speaking to some former high-res developers, I really hope you guys land on your feet by the way, but I neglected to mention that Paladins was made using UE3, aka Unreal Engine 3. That's because I was going to mention it in this video, because Smite, a game set to be playable in just a few years at the time of the timeline, was being built with an engine that was already 8 years old. In their defense, UE4 wouldn't launch fully until 2014, though it was already accessible by a couple developers in early access from 2012. Closed beta for Smite.
Wow, that's really unfortunate timing then, huh? You know, right as they were starting to develop Smite is like kind of the end of UE3's life cycle, but UE4 wasn't fully out like commercially yet. Things could have been probably quite a bit different if UE4 launched like 2 or 3 years earlier than it did and Smite 1 was built on UE4 from the start, because the leap from UE3 to UE4 was absolutely massive. They maybe could have done a lot more with the game, and maybe, you know, Smite 2 wouldn't have been as necessary. Obviously, there's still a bunch of other things Smite 2 did, not just the engine upgrade. But the engine upgrade was a decent part of it. You know, they were really stuck in UE3. You know, it's an engine that was made in like 2005 or something like that. If it had been built on UE4 from the start, you know, if that had released a couple of years earlier, it probably would have been a bit of a different situation in that regard.
Would commence May 2012, and you would need a key to access it. Or if you played the previous high-res games, you were invited, because I'm pretty sure I got an invitation from playing Tribes. Smite during the closed beta days, though, was a different beast, naturally. It had a fraction of the gods in the game, of course, accessible, but it featured largely more 2-1-2 map play, which was kind of more common in MOBAs at the time due to the jungle difficulty and lack of popularity of it, and I can speak to that because I sucked at it. And the jungle wasn't really featured in the lane either. Now, I was personally interested in Smite simply due to the usage of Greek, though more so the Roman styling of the gods, which I was obsessed with as a child, reading Edith Hamilton's mythology in 4th grade. But Smite for 2000.
Yeah, I think that brought a lot of us in, dude. That brought a lot of us in. That was definitely part of the reason why I started playing Smite. It was mainly the third-person camera and the gods and mythology. I'd never played a MOBA before. Like, Smite was my first MOBA, and kind of still is my only MOBA, really. Now, I've obviously played other ones, but not to any significant extent.
12 was looking revolutionary, me as a fan of gods or not. You have to think. Paragon, the other well-known but short-lived third-person MOBA, came out in like 2016. That was a whole 4 years later. There wasn't really anything like it, unlike what Paladins would become in many other high-res projects. Smite was unique. The third-person angle was something new and exciting, and it wasn't just a gimmick, especially after Paladins removed their third-person mode. Open beta for Smite would take place in January of 2013 and would be most people's first time playing the game. And during this time, Hi-Rez would sell founder packs, granting player access to the current crop of gods and any future gods in the process, all priced at around $40 or less. And this is a great deal, and it's something that other games take inspiration from still today. Quietly in the fall of 2013, Smite would enter a deal with the devil. Just kidding, it's just Tencent. But Tencent was famous for publishing and then taking over Riot Games and Epic Games, just about, and would now be publishing another MOBA, this time a third-person one and only in China. This might seem weird to some. Why would they be competing with themselves? But in reality, it's genius because the Chinese Tencent was cornering the entirety of the MOBA market, except Dota at this point, making their grasp pretty much inescapable.
Yeah, the amount of money they probably paid to acquire Smite rights in China was, you know, the drop in the bucket compared to the amount of money that Tencent and China has as a whole. So just to be able to corner the market and make sure they don't have any real competition, definitely worth it for them, I would assume.
Smite would launch on Windows March 25th, 2014 and would receive quite positive reviews from even major review outlets, managing to score an 80 out of 100 from 21 different major critics on aggregate review website Metacritic. For example, Leah B. Jackson of IGN gave the game an 8.5 out of 10 and stated that its unique camera angle alone was enough to set the game apart, and yet there was even more to enjoy and appreciate, such as the variety and look of the gods and the polish of the map. Season 1 for Smite would start May 2014 and would feature the ranked mode for the game, which would feature a true skill style system instead of your typical win-loss system. Conquest was the game's standard mode, common in most MOBAs, but something unique in Smite, and arguably one of their coolest aspects, was that besides the setting and characters, was that the fact that the game actually had some pretty good side modes, providing alternate play to the 5 vs 5 mode, Conquest. Joust, for example, was a fan favorite 3 vs 3 map that focused more on the action with only one lane and would be introduced during this time. Arguably the
Joust was very popular for a long time. I think Joust was the most popular mode for a couple of years back in sort of like the middle days of Smite 1, I would say. Not in the super early days, that was Conquest. Not in the super later days, that was also Conquest or Arena. But yeah, for a little while, I don't remember the exact time frame, maybe like 2015 to 2017, 18, kind of around that time. Joust was the most popular mod for a decent while. Not by a massive amount. Joust, Conquest, and Arena have always been relatively close to each other, but yeah, it was for a while the most popular mod.
And Smite are more famous than the main mode, partly due to their unique gameplay offered by comparison, and other in part due to them being largely unique to Smite, and not a copy from some other game or the parent genre. A free-to-play game, Smite, won, a few months after its launch would already claim 4 million players. Now this wasn't their active player base, but it was still impressive. Smite would even team up with Level Up Games in Latin America and would help increase that number, however. Smite's first World Championship would take place in 2015 in the spring and would feature a whopping $2.6 million in prize pool.
That was nuts,
I would
dude.
normally critique this because it's like, wow, that's a crap ton of money for a game that doesn't even have a scene yet, as being early to a scene before it even takes place and forms organically is also not a very good thing, which is still true, but at the very least, the pool was largely obtained through the purchase of an Odyssey pack, sort of like the Compendium and Dota. This would allow for the sales to contribute to the prize pool, which is why it was so significant already.
That was so huge, man. I don't know why they never did this again, to be honest. Maybe it's just because they would rather make the money for the studio themselves rather than make it for a prize pool. But like that was such a good way to fund a prize pool, you know. It probably did drive more sales of like Odyssey and stuff like that because they knew that it was going to be going towards esports. Like for me personally, I don't really buy full Odysseys all that much, but I feel like you know, if I knew it was going towards like esports prize pools and stuff, I'd be much more willing to buy like the whole thing or whatever.
Meant to be made. If Smite could succeed as an esport, they would be able to attract more players to their game and thus more revenue. However, if they spent too much time, money, and resources on a scene that nobody watched or cared about, it could all be for naught. Season 2 would launch February 2015, introducing a new Conquest map, a much sexier one I might add, and even then, a few more gods to release over the course of the season, which would become pretty typical with Smite going on even to current day. Contrast this to Heroes of the Storm, and Smite released far more characters more consistently. Smite's brother, Paladins, would launch August 2015, and I only mention it because Hi-Rez wasn't a big company, and they were having to split their resources to chase more trends, or in Paladins' case, at least initially, try their own unique attempts at a genre, kind of like with Smite. But Hi-Rez never...
Yeah, Paladins is a little bit different. They were just chasing trends. That's kind of what Hi-Rez do as a company in general. Even Smite was just chasing trends, but they do try and put that unique spin on it and try and make something that is genuinely unique and not like in direct competition with what they're trying to copy, essentially. And I think Paladins did find that balance a little bit. Not quite as much as Smite. Smite was definitely more unique compared to its peers compared to Paladins, but it did find its own unique niche, and it was actually more popular than Smite at one point, was Paladins. But as usual, mismanaged, ended up dying.
really seemed to scale up to expectations and remained a rather small company. Like, sure, saying Hi-Rez has like 450 people working at the company, which probably a lot less now after layoffs multiple times, sounds like a crap ton, but remember, they have like 6 or 7 games that they're working on. So in reality, does Smite actually have hundreds of developers working on it? Probably nowhere close. Smite would arrive on Xbox in the fall of 2015. And this was actually one of the geniuses of Smite, in my opinion. It was one of the first MOBAs to come to console, literally, and it eventually became one of the most dominant ones there too. I mean, I know so many gamers who played Smite on console first before ever playing another MOBA, like my cousin Ty. So it really was an effective gateway drug for so many players tapping into an all-new audience. I mean, Hi-Rez...
Yeah, it was really smart, the console release, 100%. You know, MOBAs like League and Dota, that even just their control systems and the way they work wouldn't really work too well on console. You know, with the third-person camera and everything's a skill shot and stuff like that, it really fit well on a controller compared to a lot of other MOBAs, and they basically cornered the entire console MOBA market. They still kind of hold that to this day, to be honest. I think they said recently that, like, console is over half of the Smite player base, which, you know, is absolutely huge if you combine all the consoles, obviously.
Had no competition on console. Hi-Rez would launch Smite 1 on Steam September 2015, and at this point, we can track their population data, where they would hit an impressive 19,957 peak players, which wasn't bad for a little brother MOBA. Smite developing a presence on Steam was crucial, because not only did it have no competition there besides Dota 2, though to be clear that's not really competition because it was orders of magnitude bigger. Like, Smite boasts like 20k players, Dota had closer to 1 million. But anyway,
Yeah, and League is very similar. League doesn't publish their player numbers, but I would imagine League has very similar numbers to Dota. A lot of people actually say League is more popular than Dota. Yeah, depending on how much more popular League is than Dota, League might have 100 times the players that Smite has. It's not really even comparable, to be honest.
Season 3 would follow shortly after, introducing a new Joust map and a slew of new gods. Smite would keep introducing new gods every year, ranging from new pantheons introduced, such as the Hindu gods and even like the old gods. The Hindu gods actually developed a lot of controversy though due to how they were introduced, such as Shiva being portrayed in a particular way, but also due to Hindu believers believing that they didn't really respect their gods or customs. And I mean,
I think Shiva was fine actually. I'm pretty sure they did a lot of research and were very careful when they released Shiva, and most of the Hindu community was quite happy with how he was portrayed. But yeah, Kali did have a little bit of controversy in that regard.
they have a point, sort of. I don't think Hi-Rez's focus was to put a ton of time into that, like Civilization style, though maybe they could have, and it could have given the game a little bit more story, something like League of Legends has, but they weren't really sensitive to a bunch of different cultures with a bunch of different sacred things and gods. But that wasn't really the point of Smite. It was more about being a crossover god that featured different gods, and that was kind of novel. I don't think it was meant to be a deep lore dive, though maybe that could have helped the game have a little bit more longevity or a bigger audience. While Season 4 was starting for Smite, February 2017, the game was celebrating 20 million players as a milestone. Smite was slowly climbing to a major multiplayer title, after becoming a cult hit. Another year and another season of updates and new gods would come, this time a new conquest map to spice things up and keep things fresh. But really, compared to when Smite was first playable, the game was in a much improved state, and I can even attest to this personally. Rock Paper Shotgun picked up the game at the time and had some improved impressions where they spoke about this. I would even argue that the new design changes and improvements, the game was almost unrecognizable in some ways, and largely in positive ways too. Hi-Rez in a attempt to consolidate their projects, now working on like 3 to 4 plus of them, at the same time would split into multiple studios, with Titan Forge Games taking over the reins on Smite. Hi-Rez wasn't just a private studio trying to make a living. They were trying to expand and get into like the hundreds of employees and become a major player. They were making all kinds of games and attempts at such. Mobile games, spin-off games of previous games, you name it, and acting a lot like a corporate studio. Hell, during this time, they even had begun development on a title that would become known as Divine Knockout, which was supposed to be like a third-person Smash Brothers. But it should be noted, after launching later on, Divine Knockout would flop so hard that none of you have even heard of it. The amount of money and resources being wasted chasing these new trends instead of buckling down on already successful games like Smite was shocking. I mean, in 2018, Hi-Rez still seemingly had no plans to transition to the new Unreal Engine, which was UE4 at the time, which had already been out for 4 years. Now, in the DOAG series,
Yeah, this is really the crux of it, man. This is really the crux of it. You know, why Smite... it's not the only reason why Smite never got super big. You know, there are definitely other reasons, like bigger competition in Dota and League. Why would you play Smite when you can play Dota and League that are much bigger and much more polished a lot of the time? But a big reason for it is just wasted resources. Like, wasted resources on these stupid mobile games that no one cares about and no one was going to play. And then even some of their more big releases, you know, like Divine Knockout, completely just absolutely flops. So many wasted resources on that could have paid for, you know, so much development on the Smite side of things. And then you take a look at Riot, you know, Riot for at least 10 years focused solely on League and making it absolutely massive. And then now, once they've become incredibly established and they can fund other games with League's revenue, they're starting to do that a little bit more now. You know, you've got like Arcane, not a game obviously, but you've got Arcane, you've got 2XKO, you've got Legends of Runeterra, which ultimately Legends of Runeterra was a bit of a flop. But yeah, now they're kind of starting to expand out into other markets, whereas I think Smite tried to do that too soon when they were too small, and they ended up spreading themselves far too thin with the amount they were working on.
He's hating on the UE3 engine, and with Smite, it's no different. It adds an insane amount of delay and clunkiness to the game that kept me away from the game, to be honest. And it's something that I've always felt and despised at the same time.
Oh my god.
However, swapping engines isn't just this magical solution you can do overnight, and just by the press of a button.
Definitely not.
But when most of the negative criticism that you're getting about the game is concerning the engine, it seemed like a no-brainer to start making a transition at some point. I mean, League of Legends never stayed the same. It changed a ton graphically, gameplay-wise, and even with its engine. Putting it off just didn't really seem like a good solution, because then you're not really competitive anymore. That could be felt after Paragon came out and felt like it was a completely different world of a game. And Paragon was built with UE4, by the way. Season 6 for Smite would take place in February of 2019. It would not only introduce the Time Wizard Merlin, it would trigger the 30 million player mark for Smite and also, according to reports, eclipse $300 million in revenue generated. Now, this is a huge number, especially for a smaller developer, but this was 1/5 of what League of Legends was making, which wasn't so bad, but that was 1/5 of what LOL was making in a single year.
Yeah.
Meaning that number for Smite was
astronomically
probably
bigger.
up to that point. LOL was making way more than them every single year. The point being that not that Smite sucks because the other game made more money, but that it was just a lot smaller compared to League of Legends and Dota 2. And when you're constantly making new games and diverting resources, it's even harder to be competitive with the titan in your field. Well, unless you're not really interested in being competitive, but just collecting their runoff, which kind of seems to be Hi-Rez's MO more so. And to be clear, I'm speaking more of the executives and those at the top. At this point, many of the OG devs started departing the company, such as Hi-Rez's Drybear, known for his champion designs and personality. But the executives at Hi-Rez, like Stuart Chisholm, the new CEO who celebrates being a game-as-a-servicer for some reason, and the two infamous founders Hi-Rez Goran and Hi-Rez Todd, were still there, and still making the same major decisions and acting the same exact way. They still were likely hamstringing Smite and their team from ever really reaching anything more than the ceiling that was just being placed on them kind of arbitrarily. Examples of this are seen with the numerous controversial departures of high-profile content creators as well as the developers, such as the ones that we already mentioned, but more like Punk Duck, Double J, and even DM Brandon, though that last one was a much-needed departure, let's be honest. Weird story, but DM Brandon actually played on my LAN team, as you can see from this footage, for early Overwatch. Though in my defense, he was a twat then and avoided any conversation with me besides just talking about how large I was, and was randomly put on my team due to last-minute changes anyway. Oh, and we won the tournament. But anyway, Hi-Rez being late on payments, being against free speech reportedly about their game, and making puzzling decisions would lead to many of the content creators departing, further lowering the overall view and player count in Smite and the popularity, with all the biggest content creators now moving to Dota 2 or League of Legends instead. But worse, remember Mixer? Yeah.
I don't think most of the big Smite content creators went to Dota or League, actually. They usually just quit or went to making variety content. Or even like Duke Sloth, for example, went to like New World or whatever, I think is what he's doing now. Like, I don't think any of the major Smite content creators went directly to League or Dota, actually.
Nobody really does, but anyway, we covered it on the Death of a Game series, and it was a streaming platform that had crazy tech and had a bunch of money thrown at it, but it fizzled out in a jiffy, like a real fast jiffy, like a Jiffy Lube jiffy. Well, Hi-Rez would enter a deal with Mixer, which would be shut down within just 2 years, and this decision severely hurt both the competitive scene for Smite, which was actually kind of thriving, and its viewership, which was growing. The general popularity and marketing for Smite as a whole, since most of the content was on Mixer, a subpar platform by comparison to Twitch in terms of reach and more. My guess is that Hi-Rez was either given a check or wanted to leverage the new platform to inflate their numbers to then get a check so they could sell the rights for SPL, aka their Pro League of Smite, to someone like YouTube or Twitch. But it was a gamble, and it didn't really work. And it was an unneeded gamble for a smaller fish trying to compete with sharks. Following the pandemic.
Yeah, in terms of the Mixer thing, like, obviously it was a bad decision. I would assume they got paid up front for it, and they probably, like, because this was around the time they transitioned to the unified local SPL with sponsored teams. They probably took that money from the Mixer deal and used it for, like, salaries and for sponsored teams and stuff like that for the players.
And subsequent world shutdown would be another season for Smite, this time season 7. During the pandemic, Smite would leverage people being stuck at home and actually increase in player count, reaching even higher numbers than they started with. This would be bolstered.
Yeah, we reached peak players during COVID, dude. Like 30-something thousand on Steam, probably a good amount on console as well.
A slew of new crossover skins in Smite, featuring the Avatar cast with Aang, Zuko, and Korra. These skins are a bit controversial because they're not actually like gods, and in a sense they kind of remove any of the style that the game has, especially like the more wacky skins in the game. I mean, Agni can literally play as a pimp who says, "Make it rain, make it rain, make it rain." And I love this. I don't
think the crossover skins are really controversial, to be honest. Maybe from an outside view looking in, I don't think most of the Smite community thinks the crossover skins are controversial. There are some specific crossovers that people think are bad, but the crossovers as a whole, I don't think are controversial at all. People love the crossovers. And especially to use Avatar as an example, like Avatar is probably the most beloved crossover that Smite's ever had.
actually breaks up the monotony and the tension that, exists in these competitive multiplayer games. But the obsession with crossover games and worlds more so comes from the success of games like Fortnite. Now, everyone was doing crossovers, including Smite. But to be fair, it seemed to pay off players-wise, with population jumping up to 31,000 players peak by the beginning of 2021. Smite would start facing its largest downtrend yet, starting in the fall of 2022. The culprit of this largely being the age of the game.
That's my video
it already
game.
was 8 years old. Its clunky engine, which was already older than some of the players playing the game, but also due to the slew of changes that were implemented that the fans just weren't enjoying. Things get worse and more complicated when you have a large number of your players not playing Conquest, but you're balancing only for Conquest. And not just Conquest, but the SPL, or the Smite Pro League. Balancing around your top players is commonplace, but when the design changes aren't appealing to the large number of players, it's just a recipe for disaster.
I don't think they were entirely balancing around SPL and Conquest a lot of the time. They had non-Conquest balance as a specific system to be able to try and fix that. If certain things were completely broken in other modes, but they weren't popular in Conquest, you could apply non-Conquest balance to them. And while, yes, they did look at the pro scene for a decent amount of their balance, because generally I think that's what you should do, because you can't really balance around people that don't know the fundamentals of how the game works, because they'll just say something's overpowered when really for most people it's not. And that's just part of the improvement of learning the game. If you're a completely new player, some things are going to seem really overpowered because you don't know how to play around them. And it's part of growing as a player and learning the game that you learn to play around these things that are basically, noob killers. Like, for example, Anubis is one or whatever. If you just walk out at Anubis and you stand there auto-attacking him while he ones you, you're going to take a lot of damage from that. And you're going to be like, that Billy is so OP. But then you realize, you can stun him out of it. You can jump away from it. You can Aegis it. You can do a lot of different things to play around that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that Anubis needs a nerf, for example. And that's why balancing around slightly higher levels of players makes some sense, I think. But yeah, they also didn't just look at the top level of players for balancing. They definitely did look at other areas of the game as well.
Season 10, as reported by the fans, would introduce multiple changes back to back that would lead to a stale meta, and even in some cases just subpar gameplay. But things would start rebounding about a year later, with a series of mini seasonal updates in 2023, introducing yet more gods and a new map. Gods had now ballooned up to an impressive over 100, and a problem started to rear its ugly head. One that Dark Ages of Camelot, an old-school virtual world pioneer we have covered before, knew quite well: crowd control, or CC, and, well, too much crowd control. Fights now in Smite had become a matter of who landed the first CC, and then subsequent fighting and CC. With so many characters being built around this and having CC themselves, one has to wonder if it was because of the limit of the game engine that they would focus more so on CC than other mechanics, perhaps just the style that Smite was kind of going for, but it was presenting problems.
I mean, part of it is just how Smite is fundamentally built. If you're comparing it to other MOBAs anyway, there was still too much CC in the game, that's for sure, but the reason there was more CC in the game than there was in other MOBAs like League or Dota, for example, is that everything in Smite is a skill shot, or almost everything. You got New Ult and Lethal or whatever that aren't. Well, 99.5% of things in Smite are skill shots, and therefore you need a bit of CC to be able to lock people down, otherwise it's just going to be everyone missing everything all the time. So that's why the game has more CC than other MOBAs do in general, but it did get a little ridiculous in the later years of Smite, and it is still a little bit ridiculous in Smite 2, to be honest. There's still a lot of CC going around.
For the less experienced players who would find a tough game to break into. Smite might be handwaved by MOBA players who never played it and only played the top-down gargantuan MOBAs, but Smite is a really hard game. I can speak from personal experience and honestly just watch these top plays on screen. The level of skill to pull off some of these plays is up there, if not higher than any of the top MOBAs.
It's unacceptable. We need more. Ascending to the heavens, Scylla, altered on Thor is here, and so is Shaheed.
Oh, nice, dude.
God move.
However, this difficulty increase of a sort kind of made Smite a little less approachable, as it had a higher skill cap now, which made the game harder to play. I think Hi-Rez could have combated this with some more noob-friendly characters and mechanics, but with their audience being smaller already, they likely focused on just focusing on their own audience versus a new one.
That's
More
generally what
restructuring
they've done,
would happen
yeah.
at Hi-Rez, and it seems like the signs were pointing to yet more shuffling behind the scenes. Hi-Rez at this point had all of their projects slowing down, with a couple just about dead or dead entirely. They were going to be really reliant on Paladins, and more so now Smite, to stay afloat as a company going forward. Hi-Rez, in a decision to keep their, although successful, especially given the circumstances, faltering competitive scene afloat, would transition the SPL to franchising. In some esports, this is either a positive or meant to be seen as a positive, I might say. But with SPL, the organizations and thus the league itself was now actually being owned by Hi-Rez themselves. They were the ones making the teams, hosting the tournaments, and designing the game, because the other pro teams had exited because it just wasn't profitable for them to remain in a scene that had such few viewers. It was just a strange situation though. But I can't hate it because the pro scene of the game was able to stay alive during this time, where players could still make money from appearances and wins. Smite's competitive scene, given the amount of players who played it and were interested in watching it, was a massive success for Smite, and this was confirmed by the executives at Hi-Rez themselves. While it's foolish to think that if you blow that up it just gets bigger and better in a linear sense, there really is a thought of what if the comp scene in Smite, to go alongside the what ifs alongside Smite itself, what if Smite had a different developer pulling the strings? More support, and simply speaking, more eyes. Many, myself included, feel that it would have been given an even more fair shake by the wider gaming population and potentially become more of a mainstream hit. UE4 had come.
It's definitely possible, yeah. Yeah, definitely possible. If they had different developers, different management, things could have gone more crazy for the game. Because I do think it was mismanaged to a large degree. It's a super fun game. It was a super fun game. Smite 2 is a super fun game. But I do think, you know, things could have been managed better throughout most of Smite's life.
Gone. And UE5, the new big sexy engine for UE, had been around for already 2 years by 2024. To put this into context, Smite, a game from 2014, was using an engine 10 years older that now at this point was 20 years older. An engine overhaul or shift was inevitable, but many players would be betrayed by what came next and how it was implemented. Hi-Rez would announce Smite 2 January 2024, which reportedly had started in development about a year prior. While things were initially uncertain about what it would mean for Smite 1, it wasn't hard to imagine that now the focus was being shifted largely to Smite 2. Smite 1 just celebrated its 11th year, with another conquest map now reaching over 125 plus gods. The game had already been out for 10 years. That's a long, successful run. A shift was bound to happen, but people's issues came from how Hi-Rez would execute things ultimately. I mean, what a surprise, right? Smite 2, earlier than anyone would imagine, would rush, or like sprint, more like to an early access launch or alpha, whatever you want to call it, August 2024. Not only was the game early, based on people's expectations of the timeline of things, worse, people weren't really impressed by what they were experiencing yet. Now, while I think a lot of that is off base personally, because I think that the game behind all of the drama is not that bad, I do think that part of it is based on the dislike of the execution of the sequel itself. Smite 2 would require veterans of Smite 1 previous Founders Pack or not to purchase a new God Pack to earn the gods now in Smite 2 through progression as typical. This would anger many fans as they felt like their skins and gods should cross over. While I personally don't think you should have this expectation of a sequel 10 years later, remember, Smite 2 wasn't a complete game yet. It featured less than half of the original Godcast, and the game, while having massive improvements because of the engine and gameplay, wasn't so obviously an upgrade. Like, sure, the graphics are improved.
Yeah, in those early days, it just wasn't an upgrade. It wasn't obviously an upgrade. It just straight up wasn't. You know, in those super early days of the alpha launch, like the alpha weekends, it was an upgrade in like 20% of areas and a downgrade in like 80% of areas. You know, it was much worse than Smite 1 in a lot of different ways. But I think it's become a long way, and I now think that's flipped. I think it's now better in 80% of areas and worse in 20% of areas. And most of the areas where Smite 2 is worse is just the total amount of content. You know, the amount of gods, the amount of skins, the amount of game modes, the amount of items, all that kind of stuff. But I think the quality of the content that is there is much better. But yeah, it was very much a fumbled launch. I think we all know that at this point.
True, but overall, the graphics feel a bit more generic. I say it wasn't so obvious because the engine shift alone is unequivocally a massive change and upgrade. That's just not debatable. But not all players can interpret that or see that to the same degree, especially if they don't play the game. And if you don't explain it to them. I mean, Smite 2 was announced and launched the same year. Whether Hi-Rez was calling it an alpha or not, it was a paid launch, meaning people could spend money on a free-to-play game. There was no time to hype the game up. And all that hype quickly evaporated when Hi-Rez would put out a schedule for the upcoming gods, where they would start promising a god every week and a new god for Smite 2 uniquely every month. They would fail to deliver on their promise of the schedule ultimately and quite quickly, angering their...
Yeah, this is a travesty, man. This was a travesty by upper management. They must have known the layoffs are coming, and they still let them promise a god a week for the next 32 weeks. That's just not something you should do. That's an embarrassment.
Base more than had they just not promised it in the first place. The worst part, at least to me personally, is Smite 2 is actually a decent game, and I've played it. Not just the engine upgrades and overhaul, but the Smite team has actually managed to take previously boring and buggy gods that were really uninspired, just because of largely the engine in my opinion, and actually make them fun and effective. This was impressive as hell to me. But with such a poor reputation staining the developers or parent company behind them, and an already rocky launch, things aren't looking good for Smite 2. And that means that things aren't looking good for Smite 1 either. Their fates are always going to be tied together. After quietly sunsetting the Nintendo Switch version in February 2025, likely due to the clunkiness of the game not fitting the platform well, which was kind of known for having seamless, smooth gameplay, Smite 2 only featured less than half of the original God cast, and was basically just being seen as an engine upgrade, which League of Legends got multiple times without having to charge for the same characters again. But again, I can't believe I'm defending Hi-Rez. The UE3 shift to UE5 was massive. It's just the way that it was handled was really bad. And
yeah, it's not comparable to League's visual updates and stuff like that. You physically could not have just ported everything over from UE3 to UE5 very easily with Smite 1. It would have taken almost as much effort as it takes to recreate the content, which is what they're doing for Smite 2.
I think that Hi-Rez just waited as long as humanly possible to do and initiate the shift, which was contributing to their issues. And well, their lack of ability to have open and honest dialogue about it didn't help things either. This is all made worse by the other failures surrounding the game with Hi-Rez, while essentially leaving their biggest breadwinner, Smite 1, to kind of flounder. This would all culminate in a critical negative moment in the history of both Smites, shocking just about everyone, including their own staff. Hi-Rez would announce laying off 70+ employees and shifting all of their development focus to Smite 2 going forward. This would mean that Smite 1, alongside a few other Hi-Rez titles, would now be put into maintenance mode, with no new content on the horizon. The bad decisions of Hi-Rez had finally come home to roost, or the chickens came home to roost, or whatever. The sad part being, Hi-Rez executives were deleting their social media and avoiding the criticism, meanwhile firing 70 employees during the process. That's because the decision of a few can hurt many, including the players and the developers behind the game. With Smite 1 put into maintenance mode and
yeah, I do ultimately think this was the right decision in terms of pulling everyone off, focusing everything onto Smite 2. I think that probably was the right decision for the company as a whole, based on the circumstances they were in. But the issue is the circumstances that they were in were probably a large part the fault of management in the first place. They're kind of trying to dig themselves out of a hole that they put themselves in, really.
Smite 2, with its rocky start hoping to avoid an early feature on the series, the timeline has terminated and the music is playing, which means we have solved the case or obtained enough clues so we can now solve the case during our final deduction. For those who missed the clues along the way, why did Smite 1 get placed into maintenance mode? And why did Smite 1 fail to reach the heights it could very well have? Well, Smite 2 launched and the focus was shifted ultimately. The Hi-Rez effect, which most of you know at this point, but if you don't, go watch the previous episodes. The game had a 10+ year old engine UE3. Hi-Rez fumbled the SPL and their stream audience. Kind of an extension. Hi-Rez decision making, and time. Now time, we always say on the series, detectives comes for all of us at different times. But I also wanted to mention, because I wanted people to know that with this video, my intention was to actually highlight how successful Smite was, sort of, in spite of everything around it, really. The Death of a Game series isn't always about failures. Sometimes we cover titles that didn't quite make it to the heights that they could have, and Smite really qualifies for that. It was a 100%. MOBA that made alternate game modes that were loved and enjoyed, and it became the de facto and only remaining third-person MOBA. It also featured, in arguably the biggest form yet, the most complete roster of gods from different cultures in a multiplayer game ever. Smite was pioneering in many ways, and shattered a lot of expectations. It also brought with it a whole new generation of gamers to the MOBA genre. I know dozens of players.
There's nothing wrong with it. There are dozens of us. Dozens!
Dozens of us who discovered Smite and used it as a gateway drug to become longtime MOBA players. It was a really special game, especially for those who spent hundreds of hours playing their favorite gods. I can't help but nerd out when I think about the idea of thousands of gamers who would have otherwise never learned about any of these gods now knowing tons of gods from different cultures. And yeah,
I would have never known any of that stuff, dude. I would have known about the basic Greek and Norse gods, and that's about it, dude. I'm kind of interested in mythology, but there's plenty I would not have known about that I know about from Smite.
End on too negative of a note, so I will say this. I wish Smite 2 the best, because without its success, we wouldn't have another third-person MOBA on the market, or any. And more variety and competition is good for gaming.
Absolutely.
Leaving refreshed Wolverine and Narrow to finish finish off the remaining tank. My God, Shadow, that was legendary.
Well, yeah, I've given my reasons. Yeah, absolutely great video. Absolutely great video. Be sure to check out Nerdslayer Studios if you like this kind of format. It seems like he does a bunch of these. He's got one on Paladins that you can watch, some other high-res games and just games in general. If you like this kind of format, be sure to go subscribe to his channel, check out his other videos. It was a really good video, in my opinion. I enjoyed it. But yeah, I just thought I would give my thoughts on it as well. I thought it was a very interesting video. Usually I'll like watch a video, I'll watch like the first like 20 or 30% of it and realize, oh, this is pretty interesting. Let's maybe do a reaction to this, and that was the case here. But yeah, let me know your own thoughts on this whole situation down below, obviously, and I will catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.